Hi, I'm Sahara Clark, and I'm 29 years old. Christmas dinner should have been warm and joyful, but instead, my mother looked across the table, wine glass in hand, and said the words that shattered me. "You're not on the will anymore." Everyone froze, forks midair. My father looked down. My sister smirked. My mother's voice was calm, almost rehearsed. In that moment, I knew this Christmas wouldn't end with hugs or family photos. It would end with me quietly placing a box on the table that none of them expected. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. For the past 7 years, my world had been circumscribed by the pale green walls and antiseptic scent of the pediatric oncology ward at Seattle General. It was a life measured not in years, but in moments. The steady beep of a heart monitor, the whisper-soft touch of a feverish forehead, the breathtaking weight of a parent's trust. It was a world away from the one I was born into, a world of polished surfaces and calculated ambition. Here, in this place of profound vulnerability, I had found my purpose. I wasn't just a nurse. I was a witness, a comforter, a quiet warrior fighting alongside the smallest, bravest humans I had ever known. Take today, for instance. I spent 3 hours with a 6-year-old named Leo, who had a fierce love for dinosaurs and a leukemia that was just as fierce. His immune system was shot, so we had to be in isolation. We played a game with his plastic T-Rex, making it stomp across the sterile white sheets of his bed, our voices low so we wouldn't disturb the other kids. His laughter was a fragile, precious sound, a tiny flicker of light in a place often shadowed by fear. His mom, a single mother who worked 2 jobs and took the bus here every day, watched us from a chair in the corner, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but filled with a gratitude so immense it was humbling. When my shift ended, she grabbed my hand, her own rough with work. "Thank you, Sahara," she whispered. "You see him. You really see our Leo." In her world, I was essential. I mattered. I would carry moments like that home with me to my small 1-bedroom apartment. It was my sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the large windows in the afternoon, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and warming the worn fabric of my secondhand sofa. My cat, a marmalade tabby also named Leo, a coincidence that made my little patient giggle, would greet me at the door, winding around my ankles, his purr a rumbling motor of welcome. My life was here, within these walls, and within the demanding, heartbreaking, and deeply fulfilling walls of the hospital. It was a life I had built myself, on a foundation of empathy and hard work. My dreams were woven from the same thread. I pictured a future with Alex, my boyfriend of 2 years. He was a high school history teacher, a man whose passion for the past was matched only by his steady, grounding presence in the now. He understood the toll my job took. He never flinched when I came home, drained and silent and just needed to be held. He listened when I needed to talk, celebrated my small victories, and reminded me of my own strength when I felt it failing. Our life together was simple. Walks in the park, cooking dinner while listening to old records, long conversations that lasted late into the night. It was a love that was quiet, deep, and real. It was everything. But this life, the one that felt so rich and meaningful to me, was a source of constant, unspoken shame for my mother, Eleanor Clark. To her, my life was a profound disappointment. She saw my profession not as a calling, but as a messy, emotional, and, worst of all, unprofitable endeavor. Eleanor's universe was the manicured landscape of the Oak Ridge Country Club, a place where worth was measured in carats and last names. Her daughters were meant to be extensions of her own ambition, ornamental proof of the family's success. They were supposed to marry well, which meant marrying into wealth, and produce grandchildren who would attend the right private schools. My career, my apartment, my gentle-hearted teacher boyfriend, they were all liabilities in her meticulously crafted social ledger. My younger sister, Emily, was my mother's greatest asset. She had followed the blueprint for a perfect life with flawless precision. She'd married Marcus, a man whose ambition was as sharp and cold as the glass and steel skyscraper where his corporate law firm resided. Their home was an architectural marvel of minimalist design, a place so devoid of personal touches, it felt more like a high-end hotel lobby than a place where people actually lived. Emily's days were a whirlwind of SoulCycle classes, charity luncheons, and consultations with her interior decorator. She didn't have a job, she had a personal brand, which she curated with relentless dedication on Instagram. Her posts were a highlight reel of a life I couldn't imagine and didn't want, sipping champagne on a yacht, posing with a new designer handbag, smiling a vacant, perfect smile. She was beautiful, polished, and utterly my mother's daughter. The contrast between us was a chasm my mother made no effort to bridge. Instead, she seemed to revel in it. using Emily's life as a cudgel to beat down my own. A phone call with her was a predictable exercise in passive aggression. I might call her after an exhausting but rewarding week, wanting to share a story about a patient who had finally turned a corner. "That's wonderful, dear," she would say, her voice betraying a distinct lack of interest. Before I could say more, she would pivot. "Speaking of which, I must tell you, Emily's committee raised over $50,000 at the hospital gala. They're getting a small plaque in the lobby. She's just so wonderful at bringing the right people together." The implication was always clear. Emily's fundraising, a social activity involving cocktails and evening gowns, was a more significant contribution to the world of medicine than my hands-on life-saving work. Her plaque in the lobby was a tangible achievement. My daily efforts were invisible, forgettable. Her disdain for Alex was just as potent, though veiled in a thin veneer of civility. When I first told her I was dating a teacher, she'd paused for a long moment before responding. "Well," she'd said, her voice dripping with pity, "I suppose that's a very noble profession." To her, noble was a synonym for poor. She couldn't comprehend a life motivated by passion rather than profit. During the few excruciating dinners Alex had attended, my mother would ask him questions that were more like interrogations, thinly disguised attempts to expose the modesty of his life. "Do you get summers off then? That must be nice, having all that free time," she'd say, ignoring the fact he spent his summers tutoring underprivileged students. She saw his compassion as a weakness, his contentment as a lack of ambition. He was, in her eyes, another one of my poor life choices, another piece of evidence in the case against me. I was the daughter who chose service over status, love over legacy. In her world, that was a crime, and I was beginning to understand that I had already been tried and found guilty. The erosion of my place in the family was a slow, methodical process, like the steady drip of water on stone. It wasn't one single act of cruelty, but 1,000 tiny cuts, each one a reminder that I was different, lesser, an outsider in my own home. Holidays were the stage upon which this drama was most painfully performed. They were my mother's chance to showcase her perfect family, and my presence was a dissonant note in her carefully composed symphony. Emily was always the crescendo, her life a series of triumphs to be announced and applauded, while I was the awkward, silent pause. The Christmas when Emily announced her engagement to Marcus was a masterclass in this dynamic. The entire evening was dedicated to her. A toast from my father praised Marcus's business acumen and welcomed him as the son he'd always wanted. My mother presented Emily with a family heirloom, a sapphire necklace that had belonged to my great-grandmother, her voice thick with emotion as she spoke of passing it down to the daughter who would carry on the family's legacy with grace and style. I had congratulated my sister warmly, genuinely happy for her, but my gesture was swallowed by the grander spectacle. Later, I tried to share my own news, that I had been accepted into a competitive master's program for nursing. My mother had smiled a tight, dismissive smile. "Oh, more school, Sahara? Don't you think it's time you focused on settling down?" she'd said, turning away before I could answer, effectively ending the conversation. The message was clear. Emily's milestone was a family achievement. Mine was a personal failing. The financial favoritism was the most tangible evidence of this disparity. It was a constant glaring scoreboard of our respective worth. The year Emily wanted a new car, my parents co-signed a loan and made the first 6 payments as a little gift. Meanwhile, I was meticulously budgeting every dollar, working double shifts to pay down my student loans. I never asked them for money, not once. My pride wouldn't let me, but one summer, the transmission on my aging Honda Civic gave out. The repair bill was nearly $2,000. A sum that felt like a mountain. For a week, I cobbled together rides with friends and navigated Seattle's complicated bus system, arriving at the hospital before dawn and getting home long after dark, exhausted to the bone. Finally, swallowing my pride, I called my father. I explained the situation, emphasizing that it would be a loan, that I would pay him back with interest. His response was a sigh of paternal disappointment. "Sahara, you're 25 years old. You need to learn to manage your finances and plan for these kinds of emergencies. This is a lesson in responsibility." He agreed to lend me the money, but the lecture stung more than a refusal would have. He made me feel like an irresponsible child. 2 days later, while waiting for my car to be fixed, I was scrolling through Instagram. Emily had posted a photo of a stunning brand new patio set, complete with a fire pit and oversized loungers. The caption read, "Surprise delivery. My parents are the absolute best. Our backyard is officially ready for summer." The injustice of it burned in my chest, a hot, bitter poison. They lectured me about fiscal responsibility for needing help with a basic necessity, while simultaneously funding my sister's luxurious lifestyle without a second thought. It wasn't about the money. It was about the message. My struggles were a character flaw. Her desires were a worthy investment. But the most searing humiliation, the memory that still had the power to make my cheeks flush with shame, was Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. I'd worked a long shift and had to fly in on a red-eye, arriving just hours before dinner. I was bone-tired, running on caffeine and fumes. In my haste to pack, I'd grabbed the first nice thing I could find in my closet, a simple dark green wool dress. I'd bought it at a consignment shop, but I loved its classic cut and the way it felt soft against my skin. I thought I looked fine, presentable. I walked into the dining room where the family was already gathered, sipping wine. The conversation lulled as I entered. Emily, who was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that looked both ridiculously expensive and incredibly comfortable, let her eyes travel from my sensible shoes up to my face. A slow, condescending smirk spread across her lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Tough day at the office, Sahara?" I ignored her, moving to kiss my mother's cheek. My mother, however, was focused on my dress. She pulled back, her perfectly manicured fingers touching the sleeve of my dress as if it were contaminated. "Goodness, Sahara," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "What is this?" "It looks like something from another decade." Emily seized the opportunity. "Oh, Mom, be nice," she chimed in, her tone anything but. "She's being sustainable." It's very resourceful of her. The word resourceful hung in the air, a euphemism for poor and cheap. A few of my cousins snickered. Marcus chuckled into his wine glass. I looked at my father, my eyes pleading with him to intervene, to say something, anything. He just looked down at his plate, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the china. His silence was a roar. It was an endorsement of their cruelty. In his refusal to defend me, he became one of them. My mother then let out a sharp, tinkling laugh, a sound like breaking glass. "She's right, darling," she said, tapping my arm. "You certainly have a knack for finding unique pieces." I stood there, rooted to the spot, my entire body burning with a shame so intense it felt like a fever. I felt like a child again, being ridiculed on the playground. But this was worse. This was my family. I wanted to turn and run, to flee the house and never come back. But I was paralyzed by a lifetime of conditioning, a deep-seated need to keep the peace, to not make a scene. So I did what I always did. I swallowed it. I forced a brittle smile onto my face, took my seat at the table, and spent the rest of the meal pretending I hadn't just been flayed alive in front of everyone I was supposed to be able to trust. I learned a vital lesson that day. I wasn't just the other daughter, the less favored one. I was their scapegoat. I was the official, designated failure against whom Emily's success could be measured and celebrated. And my role was to stand there and take it. The final crack in my carefully constructed facade of resilience began with a whisper. It was last Christmas, an evening that had been, until its final moments, a predictable blend of forced cheer and quiet tension. I had survived the main course, deflecting my mother's pointed questions about why Alex wasn't with me. He was spending the holiday with his own family, a concept she found personally offensive, and enduring Marcus's long, boring monologue about his investment portfolio. I thought I had made it through. I thought I was safe. As the guests began to depart, bundling up against the cold night air, I found myself in the kitchen, rinsing dessert plates and stacking them in the dishwasher. It was a familiar role for me, the helper, the one who quietly cleaned up the mess left by others. My mother entered, gliding across the gleaming hardwood floor, a silk shawl draped over her shoulders. She didn't offer to help. She simply stood beside me, her presence radiating a cold disapproval. For a moment we stood in silence, the only sound the running water and the distant murmur of goodbyes. "You know, Sahara," she began, her voice a low, confidential murmur that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "I have to be honest with you. That dress is just not right for the occasion. It's a bit drab." I paused, my hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. The dress was a simple, tasteful navy blue sheath, the most expensive piece of clothing I owned. I had bought it specifically for this night, hoping, foolishly, that it would meet her impossible standards. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mom," I managed to say, my voice tight and thin. She waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that brushed away my feelings as if they were crumbs on the counter. "It's not just the dress, darling. It's the whole presentation. You don't make an effort. Your hair is just there. You're not wearing any jewelry. You look tired," she sighed, a sound of profound theatrical burden. "Emily understands these things. She knows how to present herself. She represents this family with grace." She leaned in closer, her perfume cloying and sweet. She delivered the final blow in a voice that was barely audible but sharp as a razor. Maybe you shouldn't come next year if you can't dress properly. Her words struck me with the force of a physical slap. It was the quiet, calculated cruelty of it that undid me. This wasn't an outburst of anger. It was a calm, deliberate statement of my inadequacy. She was setting terms and conditions on my inclusion in my own family. My worthiness was not inherent. It was conditional upon my appearance, my ability to represent the family. I didn't say a word. I simply turned off the water, dried my hands, and walked out of the kitchen, past my father who stood in the hallway and pretended not to see the look on my face. I left without saying goodbye. The entire drive back to my apartment, her whisper echoed in my ears. Maybe you shouldn't come. That whisper became the soundtrack to my year. It was there when I woke up in the morning and when I tried to fall asleep at night. It was a constant, gnawing reminder that my mother's love was not a given, but a prize for which I was failing to compete. For months, I kept my distance. I let calls go to voicemail. I responded to texts with one-word answers. I poured myself into my work and into my relationship with Alex. He was my rock, the one person who saw the wounds my family inflicted and helped me tend to them. He was the one who, after I finally told him what my mother had said, held me while I cried and said, "You don't need their permission to be worthy, Sahara. You already are." His words, and the quiet, steady love of his own family, began to heal something in me. I spent a weekend with them in July. His mother, Maria, pulled out boxes of old photo albums, and we sat on the floor, laughing at pictures of a younger Alex with a bad haircut and braces. She told stories filled with such warmth and unabashed affection, stories of a childhood that was cherished and celebrated, flaws and all. There was no talk of legacies or presentations, only of love. I went home that night feeling a profound sense of grief for the childhood I never had. That evening, driven by a new, painful curiosity, I climbed onto a stepladder and pulled a dusty cardboard box from the top of my closet. It was filled with the detritus of my youth that my mother had deemed unworthy of keeping in her own pristine home. Report cards, school projects, a few tarnished track and field medals. Tucked at the very bottom was a small, flimsy photo album with a faded floral cover. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with photos I hadn't seen in years. And then I found it. The photograph was slightly faded, the corners soft with age. It was me, at about 4 years old, sitting on my mother's lap on the front porch of our old house. I was wearing red overalls and a bright, uninhibited grin, my hair a wild halo of curls. My mother was looking down at me, not at the camera, and her expression stopped my breath. It was a look of such pure, unguarded tenderness. Her smile was soft, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Her arms were wrapped around me, holding me tight, holding me safe. It was a picture of a mother and a daughter who loved each other. Staring at that image, I felt a wave of clarity wash over me. So sharp and cold it felt like plunging into an icy sea. The woman in this picture, the mother who had looked at me with such love, was gone. The little girl, the one who believed in that love without question, was gone too. My mother hadn't just neglected me. She had actively erased that version of our history, replacing it with a narrative of my failure and her disappointment. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. This Christmas, I would go back, not to plead for her love, not to try and win her approval, but to hold up a mirror, to show her exactly what she had thrown away. The next day, I took the photograph to a small, quiet frame shop. I chose a simple, elegant gold frame, one that would look beautiful and important. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a piece of heavy cardstock and a pen. My hand trembled as I wrote the words, but my resolve was firm. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. This is the daughter you erased. Merry Christmas from the family you lost. I tucked the note behind the photo, wrapped the frame in shimmering gold paper, and tied it with a perfect red silk ribbon. The finished package looked beautiful, innocuous, a lovely gift, but I knew what it really was. It was a final, silent goodbye. It was my breaking point, not in a way they would expect, but in the quiet, resolute claiming of my own story. The air in my parents' house on Christmas Day was thick with the scent of pine needles and unspoken resentments. A fire crackled in the grand stone fireplace, its warmth a deceptive illusion in a room that felt emotionally frigid. The towering Christmas tree, adorned in a symphony of gold and white, stood like a silent, glittering sentinel, a testament to my mother's obsession with perfection. Every ornament was perfectly placed, every light twinkling in unison. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly joyless. I moved through the room feeling like a ghost, a specter at a feast I was not truly invited to. My relatives offered polite, strained greetings. My Aunt Sarah gave me a quick, nervous hug, her eyes darting towards my mother as if seeking approval. My Uncle Mark mumbled something about the Seattle weather before turning away abruptly. It was clear the script for the evening had already been distributed. I was to be treated with a cautious, polite distance. I was a problem to be managed. I sat on a plush armchair in the corner, nursing a glass of sparkling water, the small, heavy box containing my gift resting at my feet, a secret anchor in the turbulent social currents. Emily was holding court by the fireplace, captivating a small audience of cousins with a dramatic retelling of a minor inconvenience she'd experienced at a luxury spa. She was radiant in a crimson dress that clung to her figure, her laughter loud and confident. Every few minutes her eyes would flick over to me, a glint of smug anticipation in them. She was an actress who couldn't wait for the third act, the one where the protagonist, her, finally triumphs. Dinner was an agonizingly slow procession of courses, each one served on my mother's best china. The conversation was a minefield of forbidden topics, namely, my life. My father, seated at the head of the table, attempted to fill the silence with a long, excruciatingly detailed account of a recent golf game. He spoke of birdies and bogeys, of sand traps and fairways, his voice a droning monotone that seemed designed to numb the senses. He would not look at me, not once. His avoidance was an act of profound cowardice, a choice to retreat into triviality rather than face the emotional carnage unfolding at his own table. He had abdicated his role as a father, choosing instead to be a passive, silent observer. As the main course, a perfectly roasted goose, was being cleared away, I felt the atmosphere shift. The air grew heavier, charged with an electric tension. This was it, the moment my mother had been waiting for. She tapped her crystal wine glass with a manicured fingernail, the clear, ringing sound slicing through the low murmur of conversation. The table fell silent. Every eye turned to her. She rose slowly, a queen addressing her court. A serene, practiced smile was fixed on her face, but her eyes were cold, hard, and focused directly on me. "I'd like to make a little announcement," she began, her voice smooth as velvet but laced with steel. "As you all know, Richard and I have always believed in the importance of legacy, of building something that lasts, something that can be passed down through generations." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She took a slow, deliberate look around the table, her gaze acknowledging her allies, Emily, Marcus, and dismissing the rest. "A legacy is not just about money or property," she continued, her voice taking on a sanctimonious tone. "It's about values. It's about carrying the family name with dignity and making choices that reflect well upon all of us. It requires a certain standard of living, a certain commitment to our way of life." My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The room felt suddenly airless, the faces around me beginning to blur at the edges. I could feel Emily's triumphant stare burning into me from across the table. "We want to ensure that the assets this family has worked so hard to build are protected and placed in the hands of those who will be proper stewards," my mother went on, her gaze now locked with mine, unblinking and utterly merciless. "Emily and Marcus have consistently demonstrated their commitment to these values. They have made us incredibly proud." She picked up her wine glass, raising it slightly. "Therefore, after much consideration, your father and I have made a decision. We have restructured our estate plan." She took a deep breath, savoring the moment, the absolute power she held. "I am announcing tonight that I have updated the will. Emily will be the sole heir. She will inherit the house, the savings, and the controlling interest in the family business." She set her glass down with a soft click. "Sahara, you are no longer included." The finality of her words was absolute. It was a public execution of my identity as her daughter. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where love and family were supposed to be. In that void, every small detail became painfully sharp. The flicker of the candlelight, the scent of melting wax, the way my father was now meticulously folding his napkin into a perfect, tight square, his focus absolute, his betrayal complete. My Aunt Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. My uncle cleared his throat and stared at the ceiling. But the most telling reaction came from Emily. She didn't even try to hide her smile. It was a slow, venomous, triumphant smirk, the look of a victor who had just watched her rival fall. The pain that washed over me was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was a physical sensation, a crushing weight on my chest that made it impossible to breathe. It wasn't about the inheritance. I had long ago made peace with the fact that I would have to build my own life. It was the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the act. The choice to do it on Christmas, a day meant for family and love. The choice to do it in public in front of an audience, to maximize my humiliation. This was not just disinheritance. It was a ritual of erasure. My mother was not just cutting me out of her will, she was cutting me out of her life. out of the family's history, and she was forcing everyone at this table to be a witness to it. For one terrifying moment, I felt the floor drop out from under me. The room began to spin, and the familiar sting of hot, helpless tears burned behind my eyes. The child in me wanted to scream, to rage, to demand an answer to the unanswerable question, "Why don't you love me?" But then I felt the solid weight of the box against my ankle. It was a reminder. I was not that helpless child anymore. They could not break me. Not tonight. The world for a long moment seemed to hold its breath. The silence in the room was a living thing, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from shock, cruelty, and shame. My mother's words, "You're no longer included," echoed in the vacuum, repeating over and over in my mind. My own heartbeat was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, each one a pinprick on my skin. They were waiting for the breakdown, the explosion of tears, the hysterical outburst that would confirm their narrative of me as the overly emotional, unstable daughter. They were waiting for me to play the role they had assigned me. In that frozen slice of time, my life seemed to split into two paths. On one, I could unleash the torrent of pain and rage that was churning inside me. I could scream at my mother for her coldness, at my father for his cowardice, at my sister for her smug triumph. I could cry, sob, and give them the satisfaction of seeing me completely undone. I could make a scene that they would talk about for years, further cementing my status as the family pariah. My body yearned for that release, for the raw, cathartic scream that had been building in my throat for years. But then, another path materialized, a quieter one. A path paved with the dignity I had fought so hard to build for myself, brick by painful brick, in a life far away from this house. I thought of my patients, the small children who faced unimaginable horrors with a courage that humbled me daily. I thought of their parents, who found the strength to keep going in the face of soul-crushing fear. I thought of Alex, whose love was a quiet, steady flame that asked for nothing but my own happiness in return. The strength I had borrowed from all of them coalesced inside me, forming a core of unshakable calm. They would not get my tears. They had taken enough from me. They would not get my dignity, too. My gaze, which had been fixed on the blurred centerpiece of roses and holly, slowly came into focus. I looked at the grain of the dark mahogany table, tracing the intricate whorls of the wood with my eyes. I focused on the single bead of condensation trickling down the side of my water glass. I anchored myself to these small, solid details of the physical world, refusing to be swept away by the emotional storm. I took a slow, silent breath and then another. The frantic drumming in my chest began to subside, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered my hands to my lap, my movements measured and calm. Then I bent down. The room was so quiet that the soft scrape of the gift box against the thick pile of the oriental rug sounded like a thunderclap. I wrapped my fingers around the crisp edges of the gold wrapping paper. The box felt heavy in my hand, heavy with the weight of memory, truth, and a final, irrevocable ending. I straightened up, my spine rigid. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at anyone. My focus was on the small, beautifully wrapped package in my hands. I rose from my chair, the legs making a soft, polite scrape against the floor. Every eye was on me, tracking my movements with a mixture of fear and fascination. I could feel their collective gaze like a physical weight. I took the 2 steps to the table, and with a steady hand, I slid the box across the polished surface. It glided smoothly, silently, coming to a stop directly in front of my mother's plate. It sat there, shimmering under the light of the chandelier, an object of beauty that contained so much pain. Only then did I lift my eyes to meet hers. Her face was a mask of confusion, her brow furrowed. The triumphant certainty she'd worn just moments before was gone, replaced by a flicker of apprehension. She had expected a fight, not a gesture she couldn't comprehend. "Merry Christmas," I whispered. My voice didn't shake. It was low, clear, and steady. It was the voice of a woman, not a wounded child. And then, I turned. I did not storm out. I did not flee. I walked. My steps were even and unhurried. It was the longest walk of my life, the dozen paces from the dining table to the grand entryway. With each step, I felt the invisible chains of their expectations, their judgment, their conditional love falling away from me. I was walking away from the constant, fruitless struggle for their approval. I was walking away from the shame, the humiliation, the feeling of being perpetually less than. I did not look back, but I could feel their stunned silence behind me. I could picture my aunt's hand still pressed to her mouth, my father's face still buried in his napkin, my sister's smirk having finally dissolved into bewilderment. In my peripheral vision, I saw the towering Christmas tree, its perfect lights now seeming to mock the shattered perfection of the evening. I reached the heavy oak door of the entryway. My hand was steady as I grasped the cold brass handle. I pulled it open, and a blast of frigid December air hit my face. It felt clean, pure, like the first breath after being underwater for too long. It was the air of freedom. I stepped across the threshold, out into the dark, quiet night. I did not slam the door. I pulled it gently shut behind me, the latch clicking into place with a soft, final sound. That click was the period at the end of a long, painful chapter of my life. I was outside, and they were inside. The separation was finally, physically, complete. I walked to my car, my sensible shoes crunching on the lightly frosted driveway. I got in, but I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there in the cold, dark silence, my hands resting on the steering wheel. The windows of the house glowed with a warm, golden light, a picture of holiday perfection that I knew was now a lie. Inside that house, chaos was likely brewing, confusion turning into anger. But out here, in the quiet solitude of my car, there was only a vast, echoing peace. The tears finally came then. Not the hot tears of shame and rage I had suppressed at the table, but slow, silent tears of grief. I was mourning the family I should have had, the mother's love I had craved for so long. I was mourning the little girl who had believed in that love unconditionally. I cried for her, and then for the woman who had finally set her free. After a few minutes, the tears subsided. I took one last look at the house, no longer my home, and turned the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing left for me to see. The silence in my apartment was a welcome embrace. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating, performative atmosphere of my parents' house. Here, there were no expectations, no judgments. There was just the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the soft, rumbling purr of my cat, Leo, who immediately curled up on my lap as if he could sense my need for uncomplicated affection. For 3 hours, I sat on my couch in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, doing nothing. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check my phone. I just let the silence wash over me, allowing the tumultuous emotions of the evening to settle like silt in a still pond. I was numb, but underneath the numbness, a strange sense of lightness was beginning to dawn. It was the feeling of a great weight having been lifted. Then, my phone, which I'd left on the kitchen counter, buzzed violently, shattering the quiet. It buzzed again and then began to ring, its shrill cry an intrusion from the world I had just escaped. I ignored it. It rang again, insistent. And again. Finally, with a sigh, I got up and looked at the screen. It was Emily. Of course, it was Emily. I let it go to voicemail, but she called back immediately. And again. On the 5th try, a morbid curiosity got the better of me. I swiped to answer, put the phone on speaker, and set it on the counter, creating a physical distance between me and her voice. "What did you do?" she shrieked, without so much as a hello. Her voice was a high-pitched, panicked thing I had never heard before. The usual cool, condescending tone was gone, replaced by pure hysteria. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Emily," I said, my own voice startlingly calm. "The box, Sahara. The present." "What did you put in that box?" she demanded. She's a wreck. You've ruined everything." I waited a beat before responding, letting her panic hang in the air. I gave her a gift. "It's Christmas, isn't it?" "That was not a gift. That was an attack," she sputtered. Through the phone, I could hear a commotion in the background, a door slamming, and a muffled wailing sound that I recognized with a jolt as my mother's voice. "What happened, Emily?" I asked, my voice still even. Emily took a shaky breath, and then the words came tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed torrent. She told me that after I'd left, the dinner party had completely disintegrated. The guests had made awkward excuses and fled within minutes, leaving the 4 of them, my mother, my father, Emily, and Marcus, sitting in a thick, toxic silence. My mother apparently had refused to touch the box at first, declaring it was some kind of dramatic, manipulative gesture. But her curiosity, Emily said, had gotten the better of her. While my father wrung his hands and Marcus stared into his glass of scotch, my mother had finally snatched the box. Emily described how my mother had torn at the beautiful gold paper with a vicious energy, her perfectly manicured nails ripping it to shreds. She'd lifted the lid and stared at the frame. For a moment, Emily said, my mother had just looked confused. Then she'd turned it over and found the note. She read it out loud. Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "This is the daughter you erased. Merry Christmas from the family you lost." According to Emily, the effect was instantaneous and terrifying. My mother let out a sound that wasn't a cry of sadness, but a guttural scream of pure, undiluted rage. She had hurled the frame across the room, where it smashed against the stone fireplace, the glass shattering into 1,000 tiny pieces. The photograph, the image of that long-lost maternal tenderness, had been destroyed. Then the hysterics had begun. She had started screaming that I was ungrateful, that I was cruel, that I had done this to deliberately hurt her. She'd apparently swept a collection of crystal glasses off the sideboard, their shattering a punctuation mark to her fury. My father had tried to calm her, but she had turned on him, screaming that this was his fault, that he was weak, that he had never been able to control me. The neighbors called. "Sahara," Emily said, her voice now trembling with a mixture of fear and accusation. "Someone thought there was a domestic assault. A police car actually drove by. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" I didn't feel the triumph I might have expected. I just felt a profound, aching sadness. The perfect image she had spent a lifetime curating had been shattered as completely as the picture frame. The ugliness she usually kept so carefully hidden behind a mask of polite society had been laid bare. "You need to fix this," Emily demanded, her voice regaining a sliver of its usual command. "You need to call her. You need to apologize." And that was when the last lingering thread of hope for my family finally snapped. Even now, after everything, they saw me as the problem. My quiet act of truth-telling was the attack, not my mother's public act of cruelty. I was expected to apologize for holding up a mirror to her. "No, Emily," I said, and my voice was resolute. "I'm not calling her, and I have nothing to apologize for." I ended the call before she could respond. I stood there in my silent kitchen, the echo of my sister's panic fading away. My phone immediately began to light up with texts. A long, rambling message from my father, full of guilt-ridden excuses and pleas to be the bigger person. A string of angry, incoherent texts from Emily. A short, confused one from my aunt, asking if I was okay. I turned the phone off and put it in a drawer. The numbness was beginning to recede, and in its place, a torrent of emotion threatened to overwhelm me. I curled up on the couch, pulling the blanket tight around me, but a deep, shuddering cold had settled in my bones. I felt utterly alone. I picked up the phone again, turned it on, and scrolled past the notifications from my family until I found Alex's name. My finger hovered over the call button for a moment, and then I pressed it. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, you," he said, his voice warm and cheerful. "How did it go?" And just like that, I broke. A raw, ragged sob escaped my throat. I couldn't speak, couldn't form words. I could only cry. The kind of deep, gut-wrenching sobs that come from a place of profound loss. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice instantly changing, filled with a calm urgency. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. He just knew he needed to be there. He arrived 20 minutes later, his face etched with concern. I was still on the couch, the storm of tears having subsided into a quiet, exhausted grief. He didn't say a word. He just came and sat beside me, wrapped his strong, warm arms around me and held me. And as I leaned into him, into the unconditional safety of his embrace, I realized that the fallout from my family's implosion didn't have to destroy me. Because I wasn't standing in the wreckage alone. I was already beginning to build a new foundation, one based not on obligation or appearance, but on the quiet, resilient strength of real love. The weeks after that Christmas were a study in silence. I kept my phone on Do Not Disturb, creating a digital fortress around my fragile peace. The barrage of calls and texts eventually slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. It seemed my family, having failed to provoke the apology they felt they were owed, had retreated to their respective corners to lick their wounds and, undoubtedly, to craft a new narrative in which I was the villain. I did not care. Their opinions, which had once held the power to shape my entire sense of self, were now just distant, meaningless noise. My quiet revenge wasn't a plot or a scheme. It was the simple, radical act of living my life well, entirely without them. The first seeds of my new life were sown on a rainy Saturday in February. Alex and I were curled up on the couch, reading, the comfortable silence a stark contrast to the fraught silences of my family home. Leo the cat was purring on my chest. Outside, the Seattle sky was a familiar shade of soft gray. Alex put his book down and turned to me, his expression serious but gentle. He took my hand, his thumb stroking my knuckles. "Sahara," he began, his voice quiet. "I've been thinking a lot about family, about what it really means. It's not about blood. It's about who shows up. It's about who loves you for who you are, not who they want you to be." He took a deep breath. "I know what you've been through has been hell, but I want to build a new world with you, one where you always feel safe and cherished and seen." He slid off the couch onto one knee, and my heart seemed to stop in my chest. He pulled a small, simple box from his pocket. It wasn't a fancy velvet box, but a smooth, hand-carved wooden one. "I love you, Sahara Clark," he said, his eyes shining. "I love your strength, your compassion, your quiet courage. I want to spend my life building a family with you, a real one. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down my face, but for the first time in a long time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. I couldn't speak, so I just nodded. A frantic, happy motion. He slid the ring onto my finger. It wasn't a massive diamond like the one on Emily's hand. It was a simple, elegant sapphire, the color of a deep twilight sky, flanked by two tiny, sparkling diamonds. It was perfect. It was me. That proposal wasn't just a question. It was an answer. It was the definitive statement that I was worthy of a love that was unconditional and true. My rebuilding was quiet, but it was profound. We were married in the fall, a small ceremony in the garden of his parents' home. Maria, Alex's mother, had insisted on hosting. She had embraced me from the moment she learned what had happened, not with pity, but with a fierce maternal protectiveness. She treated me like the daughter she had always wanted. She helped me pick out my dress, held my hand when I cried during the ceremony, and in a gesture that meant more than any expensive gift, she gave me her own mother's simple pearl earrings to wear. "Something old," she'd whispered, her eyes warm, "and a welcome to the family." My own mother, of course, was not there. I had sent a simple, formal invitation, an act of due diligence. It was returned unopened, with the words, "Return to sender," scrawled across the front in my mother's elegant, angry script. Seeing it didn't even hurt. It just confirmed that I had made the right choice. My professional life blossomed in the absence of my family's constant, subtle belittling. Without their voices in my head telling me my job was unimportant, I was able to fully embrace my passion and my skill. I took on more responsibility at the hospital, mentoring new nurses, leading a committee to improve patient-family communication. I found my voice not just as a caregiver but as a leader. One afternoon, the chief nursing officer called me into her office. I was nervous, my mind racing through all the things I could have done wrong. But she was smiling. She told me she had been watching me for months, impressed by my competence, my compassion, and my calm demeanor under pressure. She offered me the position of charge nurse for the entire pediatric wing. It was a huge promotion, a recognition of the very dedication my family had dismissed as a noble but foolish choice. My first call after leaving her office was to Alex. His shout of pure joy was the only validation I needed. News from my old life trickled in through the grapevine, mostly via my Aunt Sarah, who would occasionally send me cautious, sympathetic emails. The perfect facade of the Clark family, it turned out, was crumbling under the weight of its own dysfunction. Without me to serve as the designated scapegoat, the cracks were beginning to show. My mother, according to my aunt, had become increasingly volatile and isolated. She had apparently sold off a significant portion of the family business, a chain of successful retail stores my grandfather had built, to cover a series of hidden debts. It turned out her lavish lifestyle was funded not just by success, but by leverage and lies. The financial pressure had put an immense strain on her and my father, whose passivity, my aunt wrote, had curdled into a deep, resentful depression. Emily and Marcus were not faring much better. The promised inheritance, it seemed, was not as grand as they had been led to believe. Their fighting, once a private affair, had become legendary. Marcus was apparently furious about the state of the family finances, and Emily, who had never had to worry about money a day in her life, was spiraling. My aunt told me that Emily had called her in tears one night, complaining that her mother was now scrutinizing her spending, questioning her choices, the same way she had once done to me. The golden child was finally learning that her mother's approval was as conditional as her love had always been. I didn't rejoice in their misery. I just felt a quiet, sad sense of inevitability. The house they had built was a house of cards. My departure hadn't knocked it down. It had simply been the gentle breeze that revealed its instability. My revenge was the life I was building, a life of substance, love, and quiet, unshakable peace. Another 2 years passed, each one further distancing me from the woman I used to be. The ghosts of Christmas past still visited sometimes, but their voices were fainter now, their power to wound diminished with each new, happy memory I created. My life with Alex was a quiet joy. We bought a small house with a big backyard, planting a garden in the spring, and watching the leaves turn in the fall. The house wasn't a showpiece like my parents' home. It was a place of comfort, filled with books, mismatched furniture, and the scent of freshly baked bread. It was a home. The greatest joy, the one that healed the deepest parts of me, arrived on a sunny morning in May. Her name was Clara, and she was my daughter. Holding her for the first time, a tiny, perfect bundle of life, I felt a love so fierce and absolute it was breathtaking. I looked into her wide, curious eyes and I made a silent vow. I would never make her feel the way my mother had made me feel. She would never have to earn my love. She would be cherished, not for what she did, but for who she was. In her, I saw not a legacy to be curated, but a soul to be nurtured. I had broken the cycle. When Clara was 6 months old, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. The return address was my parents' house. My first instinct was to throw it in the trash, unopened. For 2 years, I had maintained a wall of absolute silence, a boundary that had been essential for my healing. But Alex, ever my voice of reason, gently took it from my hand. "Maybe you should read it," he said. "Not for them, for you, so you know." With a sense of trepidation, I opened it. The letter was from my father. His handwriting, once so bold and confident, was now shaky, almost frail. It was a long, rambling letter, a confusing mixture of apology and self-pity. He wrote that he was sorry for what had happened, that he had never stopped loving me, that he had been a coward. He wrote that my mother was not well, that she was consumed by a bitterness that was eating her alive, that she refused to speak my name. He wrote that he had heard through my aunt that I had a daughter. The final lines were a plea. "I am an old man, Sahara. I have made so many mistakes. My deepest regret is that I might never meet my granddaughter. Please, can you find it in your heart to let me see her?" I read the letter twice, my emotions a tangled mess. The little girl in me, the one who had always longed for her father's protection, felt a pang of sympathy. But the woman I had become, the mother I now was, felt a cold, protective anger. His regret was born of his own loneliness, not of a true understanding of the pain he had caused. He was asking for access to my daughter, a child born of the love and stability he had actively worked to undermine. That night, I discussed it with Alex. I laid out all my fears, all my anger, all my residual pain. He stood by and watched them tear me down, Alex, I said, my voice thick with emotion. He never once defended me. How can I trust him around our daughter? How can I let that dysfunction, that weakness, touch her life? Alex listened patiently, as he always did. When I was finished, he simply said, "This is your decision, Sahara, and whatever you choose, I will support you. But remember, forgiveness isn't about them. It isn't about saying what they did was okay. It's about you. It's about letting go of the anger so it doesn't poison your life anymore." His words resonated deep within me. Forgiveness. For so long, I had thought of forgiveness as something I would grant them, a gift they didn't deserve. But I realize now that forgiveness was a gift I needed to give myself. The anger I held onto was a chain, still linking me to them, still allowing them to take up space in my heart and my mind. Forgiving them didn't mean I had to forget. It didn't mean I had to let them back into my life. It simply meant I could let go of the hope that they would ever be the family I needed them to be, and accept them for who they were, flawed, broken people who were incapable of giving me the love I deserved. And with that realization came a profound sense of peace. The power was finally truly mine. The old me would have agonized over how to respond to my father's letter. The new me knew that my response was my choice, and it would be on my terms. I didn't need to engage in a long, drawn-out negotiation. I didn't need to explain or justify my feelings. I sat down and wrote a short, simple response. I did not address the past. I did not assign blame. I simply set the terms for the future. "Dear Dad, thank you for your letter. I am a mother now, and my daughter's well-being is my absolute priority. Any future relationship will be conditional on a foundation of respect, honesty, and kindness. There will be no cruelty, no manipulation, and no passive silence in the face of it. If you and Mom are willing to engage on these terms, we can talk about a path forward. The choice is yours." Sincerely, Sahara, I sent the letter and felt a final, quiet click inside me, like a lock falling into place. I had no idea if he would respond, or if they were even capable of meeting those terms. But for the first time, it didn't matter. My happiness was no longer contingent on their actions. Later that afternoon, I was sitting in a rocking chair in Clara's nursery, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window. She was asleep in my arms, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. I looked down at her sweet, innocent face, and my heart was so full of love it felt like it might burst. I thought of the photograph that had started it all. The picture of a mother looking at her daughter with pure, unconditional love. I had grieved for the loss of that mother, but now, holding my own daughter, I realized that Mother hadn't been lost. She was right here. She was me. I hadn't needed to win her back. I had needed to become her. And in doing so, I had finally, completely saved myself. So that's my story. They tried to erase me, to declare me worthless on the night that's meant to celebrate family, but their cruelty was the catalyst for my freedom. I never sought revenge. I never chased their approval again. Instead, I chose peace. I chose to build a new family on a foundation of love, not obligation. It turns out the greatest revenge isn't loud and explosive. It's the quiet, steady, undeniable happiness of a life well lived, a life they are no longer a part of. So tell me, have you ever been rejected by your own family during what should have been a happy moment? Drop your story in the comments because I know I'm not alone. And if you believe no one should have to beg for love, hit that like button and subscribe. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is simple, choosing yourself.